It was a crisp autumn evening in New York City. The streets buzzed with their usual chaos: honking horns, the shouts of street vendors, and hurried footsteps against the backdrop of towering buildings. Officer Mike Thompson, a seasoned cop in his late 30s, patrolled his beat along the quieter avenues. Stocky with short, neatly combed brown hair, Mike carried himself with the calm authority that years on the force had instilled in him. As he turned onto a less crowded street, something unusual caught his eye. A small figure sat slumped against a brick wall. A young girl, no older than 8, was huddled on the cold pavement, knees drawn to her chest. She wore a thin, ragged sweater and scuffed sneakers that looked far too worn for the brisk chill of the evening. Her brown eyes darted nervously, filled with tears, while streaks of dirt smudged her pale face. Mike's heart clenched at the sight. He crouched down a few feet away to avoid startling her. "Hey there," he began softly, his voice as gentle as he could make it. "My name's Mike. I'm a police officer. Are you okay?" The girl stiffened but didn't move or answer. Her thin arms wrapped tighter around her knees, and her lips quivered as though holding back a sob. Mike gave her a moment, then tried again, his voice steady. "You don't have to be scared. I just want to help. Can you tell me your name?" This time, the girl whispered, barely audible, "Lily." "Lily," Mike repeated, nodding encouragingly. "That's a lovely name. Can you tell me what's wrong? Why are you out here by yourself?" Her eyes darted toward him before dropping back to her knees. Tears spilled silently down her cheeks, and after a long pause, she whispered, "Please, help me." Those 3 words hit Mike like a punch to the chest. The desperation in her voice was unmistakable. He pulled his radio from his belt and spoke calmly into it. "This is Officer Thompson. I need backup at the corner of 5th and Main. Possible child in distress." As he waited for a response, he removed his navy jacket and gently draped it over her trembling shoulders. "Here you go. It's a little big, but it'll keep you warm," he said with a small smile. "Don't worry, Lily. We're going to figure this out together." Her only response was a slight nod, but Mike could tell she was still frightened. He kept his distance, but stayed close enough to let her feel his protective presence. A shopkeeper from across the street cautiously approached, keeping his distance from the frightened child. "Officer, I noticed her earlier. She's been sitting there for hours. People tried talking to her, but she wouldn't say a word. Poor thing looks terrified," the man explained. "Thanks for letting me know," Mike replied, his expression grim. "We're going to take care of her." Moments later, his partner Sarah arrived. Tall and sharp-eyed, Sarah had a commanding presence that made her an invaluable asset on the force. Her sandy blonde hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, and her sharp gaze softened as she took in the situation. "What do we have, Mike?" she asked, crouching beside him. "Her name's Lily," Mike said quietly. "She's scared, alone, and asking for help. That's all I've gotten so far." Sarah knelt closer to Lily, her voice warm but firm. "Hi, Lily. I'm Officer Sarah. You're safe now. We just want to make sure you're okay. Can you tell us anything about where you're from? Or who we can call to help you?" Lily glanced at Sarah but remained silent, her small fingers gripping Mike's jacket as though it were a lifeline. Mike exchanged a worried glance with Sarah. They both knew the clock was ticking. Whatever had left this girl on the streets in tears wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something far more serious. "All right, Lily," Sarah said gently. "You don't have to talk now if you don't want to. But we're not leaving you alone. Let's get you somewhere warm and safe, okay?" As Sarah radioed for additional resources, Mike stayed with Lily, doing his best to comfort her. In the quiet of that city street, surrounded by the faint hum of distant traffic, he knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning of a long, harrowing night. Lily sat quietly in the back of the patrol car, wrapped in a blanket Sarah had pulled from the trunk. The hum of the engine provided a faint backdrop to the tension in the air. Mike and Sarah exchanged glances in the front seat, each silently questioning the circumstances that had led this little girl to such a desperate state. "I've seen scared kids before," Sarah said softly, breaking the silence. "But there's something about her. It's not just fear. She looks like she's been through hell." Mike nodded. "She hasn't said much, but those 3 words, Please help me. Keep playing in my head. We need to find out what's going on and fast. They pulled into the precinct parking lot, where a dim light flickered over the entrance. Mike stepped out first, opening the door for Lily. She hesitated, her small hands clutching the edges of the blanket. It's okay, he assured her. We're going to take care of you. Lily followed reluctantly, her gaze darting nervously around the busy station. Officers moved briskly, phones rang, and papers shuffled. A chaotic orchestra that seemed overwhelming to her. Mike guided her to a quieter corner of the station, where Sarah had set up a small desk with crayons and paper. Do you like to draw, Lily? Sarah asked gently, pulling out a chair for her. You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but maybe you can show us something. Lily looked up at Sarah, her expression wary but curious. Slowly, she climbed into the chair and picked up a blue crayon. Mike and Sarah stepped back, giving her some space. She needs to feel safe before she'll open up, Sarah murmured. We've got to tread carefully. Mike nodded. I'll check with missing persons and see if there's been any report matching her description. As Mike disappeared into another office, Sarah stayed close to Lily, offering quiet encouragement. You're doing great, Lily. Take your time. After a few minutes, Lily began drawing. A crude but clear image of a large house with tall windows and a fence surrounding it. Sarah's brow furrowed as she studied the picture. Is this where you live? Sarah asked softly. Lily paused, then shook her head. She added a figure to the drawing, a small stick figure standing outside the house, separated by the fence. Then she picked up a red crayon and scribbled over the figure until it was almost unrecognizable. Sarah crouched beside her, her voice steady. Lily, does this house have something to do with why you're scared? Lily's hand trembled as she set the crayon down. She didn't answer, but the tears welling in her eyes said enough. Just then, Mike returned, his expression grim. No matches in missing persons. Either she hasn't been reported, or there's more to this story. Before Sarah could respond, Lily spoke for the first time since the car ride. Her voice was shaky but determined. They're watching me. Both officers froze, exchanging alarmed looks. Sarah leaned closer, keeping her tone calm. Who's watching you, Lily? Lily's voice cracked as she whispered. The people in the big house. They hurt me. The weight of her words hung heavy in the room. Mike pulled out his notepad, his jaw tight. We need more details, but let's not push her too hard right now. Sarah nodded, turning back to Lily. Thank you for telling us, sweetheart. We're going to keep you safe, okay? Nobody can hurt you anymore. Lily looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with a flicker of trust. Promise? I promise, Sarah said firmly. But we need to know more about this house. Can you tell us where it is? Lily hesitated, then pointed at her drawing. It's far, but I remember the way. I can show you. Mike tapped his pen against his notepad, his mind racing. We'll need to bring in CPS and get clearance before we take her out. We can't risk moving without backup. Sarah agreed. Let's start the process. But, Mike, something tells me this isn't just a domestic case. That house she drew, it's not a safe place. We've got to act fast. Mike's expression hardened. We will. Tonight, we figure out what's really going on. In the quiet corner of the precinct, Lily watched them with a mixture of hope and fear, her fragile trust resting in the hands of two officers who now carried the weight of her cry for help. The next morning, the station bustled with its usual energy, but the case involving Lily had everyone on edge. The image of the mansion in her drawing lingered in Mike and Sarah's minds. Despite her young age, Lily's descriptions carried a vividness that left no doubt about the seriousness of the situation. They had only scratched the surface, but already, it was clear this was no ordinary case. Mike was at his desk, sorting through leads when Sarah approached, holding a file. I did some digging. There's an area uptown with several houses matching her description. Most are old money, wealthy families with a reputation for keeping to themselves. Mike glanced up. That narrows it down, but we can't just knock on doors. We need a solid lead before we involve her again. Sarah nodded, her sharp eyes scanning the station. Agreed. I requested patrols near that area. If we're lucky, something might stand out. Just then, the Child Protective Services, CPS, Worker assigned to Lily's case walked in. Janice, a no-nonsense woman in her early 50s with graying hair and a firm but kind expression, approached Mike and Sarah with an air of determination. "I've spoken with Lily," Janice began. "She's guarded, but she trusts you too. That's a rare thing in cases like this. She might open up more if she feels safe." Sarah folded her arms. "We've been careful, but her fear is palpable. She mentioned being watched and hurt by people in a big house. Does that align with anything she said to you?" Janice sighed. "She's terrified of being taken back. Whatever happened in that house left her deeply traumatized. If we can confirm her claims, we're looking at something far bigger than one child in danger." Mike tapped his pen against the desk, his jaw tightening. "We need to keep her in a secure location while we investigate. If there's any chance these people are still looking for her, she's not safe out in the open." Janice agreed. "She'll stay in protective custody. In the meantime, I suggest you focus on that neighborhood. I'll handle the legal end to ensure no one can interfere." After Janice left, Mike turned to Sarah. "Let's hit the ground. If Lily's drawing is accurate, someone in that area knows something. We'll split up and start asking questions." Sarah smirked. "Good cop, bad cop?" Mike chuckled. "You're better at the bad cop thing. I'll stick to charm." The upscale neighborhood was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Massive oak trees lined the streets, their golden leaves carpeting the sidewalks. The houses were sprawling, each more elaborate than the last, with wrought iron gates and manicured lawns. It was a picture-perfect suburban paradise, but Mike and Sarah knew better than to trust appearances. Mike approached a man trimming hedges in front of a large Tudor-style home. "Excuse me, sir. I'm Officer Thompson. We're looking into a situation involving a property in this area. Have you noticed anything unusual lately?" The man paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Unusual? No, not really. This is a quiet neighborhood. What's going on?" "We're just following up on a report," Mike replied vaguely. "Do you know if anyone nearby has had visitors or activity that seemed out of place?" The man shrugged. "Not that I've seen, but you might try the Johnson place down the block. They keep to themselves, and there's been a lot of delivery trucks going in and out lately. Strange for a single guy living alone." Mike made a mental note and thanked the man before heading back to the car, where Sarah was already waiting. "Get anything?" she asked. "Yeah," Mike replied. "The Johnson place. Apparently, it's been unusually busy for a guy who lives alone." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "I spoke with someone who said they've heard kids crying near that house late at night. Thought it was just the TV." Mike's expression darkened. "Sounds like we've got our first real lead." Back at the station, they cross-referenced the address with city records. The mansion was owned by a man named Philip Johnson, a wealthy real estate developer with no immediate family. His financials were clean, but something about the pristine records raised a red flag for Sarah. "People with nothing to hide don't look this perfect on paper," she muttered. Mike nodded. "Agreed. Let's see what else we can dig up before we pay him a visit. We need to be ready for anything." As they pieced together the fragments of Lily's story, the gravity of the case became clearer. This wasn't just about one child. It was about uncovering the truth in a world that often buried its darkest secrets behind polished facades. Mike sat at his desk, staring at the photograph he had just taken of Lily. Her expression, though still tinged with fear, carried a flicker of trust. He tapped his pen against his notebook, deep in thought. Next to him, Sarah typed away on her computer, entering details into the system. "We need to get her face out there," Mike said. "If someone recognizes her, it could lead us to her family, or at least someone who knows what's going on." Sarah nodded. "Agreed. I'll upload it to our internal system and notify precincts across the boroughs. But let's keep this under wraps for now. If whoever's behind this finds out we're looking for them, they might panic." Mike frowned. "And if they panic, Lily could be in even more danger." Sarah sent the file and leaned back in her chair. "I flagged it as high priority. We should hear back soon if there's a match." Across the station, Janice from CPS entered, holding a thick folder. "I've been going through past cases in this area," she said, placing the folder on the desk. "There's a disturbing pattern. Over the last 3 years, several children have been reported missing from neighborhoods near where Lily was found. Most were never located, Mike opened the folder, scanning the list of names and faces. You think it's connected? Janice nodded gravely. I do. The reports describe similar circumstances, kids disappearing without a trace, usually from lower-income areas. No ransom notes, no suspects, just gone. Sarah leaned over the desk, her eyes narrowing. And now Lily's the first one we've found alive. That can't be a coincidence. Mike excused himself and walked down the hall to the holding area where Lily was staying under supervision. The small room was set up with toys, books, and a cot, an attempt to make her feel safe. She sat on the floor, quietly coloring in a book Sarah had given her. Hey, Lily, Mike said softly, kneeling down to her level. How are you doing, kiddo? She looked up, her big brown eyes meeting his. Okay, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I have a question for you, Mike continued gently. We're trying to find your family, or someone who might know you. Do you remember anyone we could talk to? A teacher? A neighbor? Maybe? Lily's face tightened. She gripped the crayon in her hand, pressing it so hard against the paper that it snapped. No, she said abruptly. Mike didn't press further. That's okay, he said, his tone soothing. You don't have to remember right now, but if anything comes to mind, you can tell me or Officer Sarah anytime, all right? Lily nodded, but her body language was stiff, closed off. Mike left the room, his heart heavy. Whatever she had been through, it was clear she wasn't ready to revisit it. Back at his desk, Mike found Sarah on the phone with another precinct. She hung up and turned to him, her expression sharp. We got a hit. A patrol in the Bronx reported seeing Lily with a man a few weeks ago. They didn't have enough to act at the time, just a suspicious interaction outside a convenience store. Mike leaned forward. Did they get a description? White male, mid-40s, average build, wearing a gray suit, Sarah replied. The officer thought it was odd because Lily looked upset, but the guy claimed to be her uncle. Mike's jaw tightened. And now we know he lied. Sarah tapped her pen against the desk. If he was bold enough to parade her around in public, he's either arrogant or thinks he's untouchable. Either way, we need to track him down. As the hours ticked by, more reports trickled in. A gas station attendant in Queens remembered seeing a man matching the description with a young girl about a month ago. A taxi driver reported dropping off a man and a child at an upscale neighborhood near the address they had flagged earlier. The pieces were slowly falling into place. Mike studied the map pinned to the board in front of them, red dots marking the sightings. Everything points back to that mansion, he said. But we need more than circumstantial evidence before we go in. Sarah stood, her determination evident. Then we get more. Let's hit the streets and start asking the right questions. Mike grabbed his coat. Let's go. The clock's ticking. As they left the station, Lily's photograph continued to circulate among precincts and community organizations. Somewhere out there, someone knew the truth, and Mike and Sarah were determined to find them before it was too late. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the bustling streets as Mike and Sarah made their way back to the upscale neighborhood they'd been investigating. Armed with Lily's drawing and the leads they'd gathered, they knew they were closing in on something significant. But they still needed a breakthrough, someone who could connect the dots. As they approached the block where the mansion stood, a frail, elderly woman stepped out onto her porch, waving hesitantly. Her appearance was unassuming. Gray curls neatly pinned back, a cardigan draped over her shoulders, and thick glasses perched on her nose. She carried an air of quiet observation, the kind of person who saw everything but rarely spoke up. Officers, she called out, her voice trembling slightly. Do you have a moment? Mike and Sarah exchanged a glance before approaching. Good afternoon, ma'am, Sarah said, her tone respectful. I'm Officer Sarah, and this is Officer Mike. How can we help you? The woman wrung her hands nervously. My name is Eleanor Jenkins. I saw you around earlier, asking questions. I think I might have some information about the little girl you're looking for. Mike's interest piqued. What kind of information, Mrs. Jenkins? She gestured for them to follow her up the porch steps. Please, come inside. It's better if we talk in private. The officers hesitated momentarily, but followed her into the modest home. The interior was warm and inviting, filled with old photographs, lace curtains, and the faint scent of lavender. Mrs. Jenkins motioned for them to sit in her cozy living room. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 50 years," she began, settling into an armchair. "I've seen a lot of things, good and bad. But in the last year, something hasn't felt right. That house down the block, the Johnson place. It gives me chills." Mike leaned forward. "What have you noticed, Mrs. Jenkins?" She sighed, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. At first, it was little things. Cars coming and going at odd hours, trucks unloading crates in the middle of the night. But then I started hearing crying. It was faint, but unmistakable. And it wasn't just once or twice. It was almost every night. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Did you ever report it?" Mrs. Jenkins shook her head, guilt clouding her expression. "I thought about it, but Mr. Johnson is a powerful man. People around here don't cross him. I was afraid." Mike's tone was gentle but firm. "You're doing the right thing by telling us now. Did you ever see children going in or out of the house?" She hesitated, then nodded. "A few weeks ago, I saw a little girl outside the gate. She was with a man, a tall, thin fellow in a suit. She looked scared, like she wanted to run. I think it might have been the girl in that picture you've been showing around." Mike felt a chill run down his spine. "Did you see where they went?" "They got into a black car," Mrs. Jenkins said. "I didn't catch the license plate, but I remember the logo. It was one of those expensive cars, a Mercedes." Sarah scribbled notes furiously. "This is good, Mrs. Jenkins. Really good. Is there anything else you can tell us about Mr. Johnson or his activities?" The elderly woman frowned, her gaze distant. "He keeps to himself, but I've seen other men visit him, well-dressed, important-looking types. They always seem to be in a hurry, like they don't want to be seen." Mike exchanged a glance with Sarah. They were circling something big, and Mrs. Jenkins's observations were filling in crucial gaps. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins," Sarah said sincerely. "Your information could help us save that little girl, and others." Mrs. Jenkins's eyes welled with tears. "I just hope it's not too late. That poor child. She deserves better." As they left the house, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on them. Mike clenched his fists as they walked toward their car. Crying at night, delivery trucks, men in suits. This isn't just some shady business. It's organized. Sarah nodded, her jaw tight. "And Johnson's at the center of it. We need to bring this to the DA and get a warrant for that house." Mike glanced back at Mrs. Jenkins's home. She took a risk coming forward. "We can't let her down." With new determination, they drove back to the station, ready to put the pieces together and take the next step in bringing Lily's story and the truth into the light. The Johnson mansion loomed at the end of the street, a towering structure of stone and glass that exuded both wealth and isolation. The wrought iron gate surrounding the property was flanked by tall hedges, shielding much of the estate from view. It looked every bit the fortress of a man who wanted to keep the outside world at bay. Mike and Sarah parked their patrol car a block away, opting to approach on foot to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. As they walked, Sarah adjusted her utility belt, her eyes scanning the area. "This place screams, I've got something to hide," she muttered. Mike nodded. "Let's keep it casual. We're just following up on a lead." As they reached the gate, they rang the buzzer. A moment later, a voice crackled through the intercom, sharp and dismissive. "Yes? This is the NYPD," Mike said, leaning into the speaker. "We'd like to ask a few questions. Is Mr. Johnson home?" There was a pause, then a click as the gate began to open. Mike and Sarah exchanged a glance, their hands instinctively resting near their holstered weapons. They walked up the cobblestone driveway, flanked by perfectly manicured gardens that seemed almost too pristine. At the massive oak door, they were greeted by Philip Johnson himself. He was a tall man in his late 40s, with a lean build and sharp features. His graying hair was combed back neatly, and he wore an expensive suit that fit him like a glove. Despite his polished appearance, there was an air of coldness about him. "Officers," Johnson said smoothly, his voice devoid of warmth. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Sarah stepped forward, her tone professional but firm. "Mr. Johnson, we're investigating a case involving a missing child. We've received reports that your property has seen unusual activity." We'd like to ask you a few questions. Johnson's expression didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed slightly. I'm afraid I have no idea what you're referring to. I live alone and lead a quiet life. Surely you're mistaken. Mike studied him carefully. We've received multiple reports from neighbors about strange noises at night and delivery trucks arriving at odd hours. Can you explain that? Johnson chuckled, the sound hollow. Ah, gossip. This neighborhood thrives on it. I've been renovating parts of the house, hence the trucks. As for noises, I can't say I've heard anything unusual. Sarah wasn't convinced. Renovations? At night? Johnson's smile tightened. Some contractors prefer working when it's quieter. It's hardly a crime, officer. Mike changed tactics. Would you mind if we looked around, just to confirm? It would help clear up any misunderstandings. Johnson's face hardened. Without a warrant, I'm afraid I can't allow that. Surely, as officers of the law, you understand the importance of privacy. Mike held his gaze. Of course, Mr. Johnson. But if you have nothing to hide, this shouldn't be an issue. For the first time, Johnson's composure slipped. His jaw clenched ever so slightly before he forced a smile. I'm sorry, officers, but I have an important meeting to attend. If you have further questions, feel free to contact my lawyer. He stepped back, shutting the door firmly behind him. Mike and Sarah stood on the porch, the tension between them palpable. He's hiding something, Sarah said, her voice low. I could see it in his eyes. Mike nodded. He's too polished. That smile was rehearsed. As they walked back down the driveway, a movement in one of the upper windows caught Mike's attention. A curtain fluttered, and for a split second, he thought he saw the outline of a small face. But it was gone before he could be sure. Did you see that? He asked Sarah, stopping in his tracks. She followed his gaze but saw nothing. What did you see? I think someone was watching us from upstairs, Mike said, his voice tense. Sarah's expression darkened. That's all the more reason to get a warrant. If there's even a chance Lily's not the only one, we can't waste time. Mike agreed. Let's get back to the station and get the paperwork started. Johnson's hiding more than just his renovations. As they drove away, the mansion seemed to loom even larger in their rearview mirror. Both officers knew they were running out of time. Whatever was happening behind those iron gates, it was far from over. Back at the precinct, the warrant request had moved faster than anticipated, thanks to Mrs. Jenkins's testimony, Lily's account, and the mounting circumstantial evidence. By early evening, Mike and Sarah stood outside the mansion again, this time flanked by a team of officers. The red and blue lights of police vehicles flashed in the growing darkness, casting an eerie glow over the pristine property. Mike adjusted his vest, his expression tense but focused. We go in carefully. Johnson's slippery, but he knows we're not playing around anymore. Sarah nodded, her hand resting on the handle of her holstered weapon. If there's even a hint of what Lily's described in there, we bring him in. No exceptions. An officer stepped forward with a crowbar, prying open the gates. They moved quickly up the driveway, their boots crunching against the cobblestone. Mike and Sarah took the lead, flanked by two other officers. They pounded on the massive oak door. Mr. Johnson, this is the NYPD. We have a warrant to search the premises. Open the door. Mike's voice was steady and commanding. There was no response. Mike signaled to the officer with the battering ram. Within seconds, the door flew open with a deafening crash. The entryway was grand and imposing, with marble floors, a sweeping staircase, and a massive chandelier hanging overhead. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of Mike's neck stand on end. Clear the main floor, Sarah instructed the team. Check every room. The officers fanned out, their voices echoing as they called out clear. After each sweep, Mike and Sarah moved toward the living room, where a large fireplace crackled softly. It was the only sign of life in the otherwise cold, sterile space. Where is he? Sarah muttered, her eyes scanning the room. Just then, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the back of the house. Mike and Sarah bolted toward the noise, their flashlights cutting through the dimly lit hallways. They found Johnson near the kitchen, his suit jacket discarded and his sleeves rolled up. He froze when he saw them. his face a mask of carefully controlled anger. "This is outrageous," he snapped. "You have no right to barge into my home like this." Mike stepped forward, holding up the warrant. "This says otherwise." "Step aside, Mr. Johnson. We're searching every inch of this place." Johnson's jaw tightened, but he moved out of the way. "You're making a mistake. You'll find nothing here." Sarah met his glare with an icy stare. "We'll see about that." As the search continued, the tension in the air grew. Officers moved methodically through the house, opening every closet, drawer, and door. The upper floors revealed nothing unusual: luxurious bedrooms, a spotless kitchen, and a library filled with books that looked more decorative than read. But it was the basement that changed everything. One of the officers called out, "Sir, ma'am, you need to see this." Mike and Sarah hurried down a narrow staircase that led to the basement. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard storage area, with shelves lined with old boxes and household supplies. But at the far end of the room, a heavy door with an electronic keypad stood out like a glaring anomaly. "Locked," the officer said, gesturing to the keypad. "Get the tech team down here," Mike ordered. "Now." Minutes later, the door clicked open, revealing a stark, windowless room. The air was cold and carried a faint, metallic smell. Inside, they found makeshift bedding, scattered toys, and a single wooden chair with restraints attached to the arms and legs. It was a chilling sight. Sarah's voice was tight with controlled fury. "This is it. This is what Lily was trying to tell us." Mike scanned the room, his stomach twisting. If Lily was here, there might be others. They returned upstairs, where Johnson sat in the living room under the watchful eye of an officer. His calm demeanor had cracked, and his hands shook as he tried to light a cigarette. Mike stepped in front of him, his voice cold. "We found the basement, Johnson. Care to explain?" Johnson's eyes darted toward the officer at the door, then back to Mike. "I don't know what you're talking about. That room's been there since I bought the house. It has nothing to do with me." Sarah scoffed. "You expect us to believe that? You're running out of excuses." Johnson leaned back in his chair, his facade of arrogance returning. "You have no proof. You can tear this house apart, but you won't find anything that links me to your so-called case." Mike's patience snapped. He leaned in close, his voice low and menacing. "We have a terrified little girl who remembers every detail of this house. You can play innocent all you want, but you and I both know what you've done." For the first time, fear flickered in Johnson's eyes. "Take him in," Sarah ordered. "We'll let the evidence do the talking." As Johnson was cuffed and let out, Mike turned to Sarah. "This isn't over. There's more to uncover here." Sarah nodded. "And we're going to find it. For Lily, and for every other kid he's hurt." The house was eerily silent after Johnson was taken into custody, leaving the officers to continue their meticulous search. The discovery of the hidden room in the basement had already provided damning evidence, but Mike and Sarah knew they couldn't stop there. If Johnson had gone to such lengths to conceal that space, there might be more secrets hidden within the sprawling mansion. "Let's check the rest of the basement," Sarah suggested, pulling on a pair of gloves. "If there's one hidden room, there could be others." Mike nodded, his flashlight cutting through the dimly lit space. The basement was a maze of storage areas and mechanical rooms, each filled with innocuous items. Boxes of old files, broken furniture, and dusty tools. But the farther they went, the more uneasy Mike felt. There was something off about the layout, as if the space had been deliberately designed to confuse. "Over here," an officer called out, gesturing toward a section of the wall. Mike and Sarah hurried over. The officer pointed to a section of the wall that looked slightly different from the rest. Newer paint, cleaner edges. Sarah knocked on it and listened. The sound was hollow. "This isn't just a wall," Sarah said. "It's hiding something." Mike nodded. "Get the tools." After several minutes of prying, the hidden panel gave way, revealing another door. This one wasn't electronic, but had a heavy padlock securing it. Sarah handed Mike a set of bolt cutters, and with a loud snap, the lock fell to the ground. The officers exchanged tense glances before pushing the door open. What lay beyond made them stop in their tracks. The room was larger than the first, dimly lit by a single overhead bulb. In the center was a makeshift cage, its bars thick and rusted. Inside, a young boy, no older than 6, sat on a filthy mattress. His eyes were wide with terror as the light flooded in, and he scrambled to the corner, shielding himself with his arms. Sarah was the first to move. She stepped forward slowly, lowering her voice to a soothing tone. "Hey, buddy. It's okay. We're police officers. You're safe now." The boy didn't respond, his small body trembling. Mike crouched down beside Sarah, his expression softening. "We're here to help you. Can you tell us your name?" The boy hesitated, his voice barely audible. "Ethan." Mike smiled gently. "Hi, Ethan. I'm Mike, and this is Sarah. We're going to get you out of here, okay?" Ethan nodded slowly, his thin frame relaxing just a little. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a granola bar, unwrapping it and handing it to him. He took it hesitantly, nibbling at the edges. Mike turned to the other officers. "Call EMS and CPS. We need to get him checked out immediately." As the boy was escorted out by paramedics, Sarah surveyed the room, her stomach churning. There were more signs of captivity. Chains bolted to the walls, tattered blankets, and discarded food containers. It was clear Ethan wasn't the first child to endure this nightmare. "This goes deeper than we thought," Sarah said, her voice tight with anger. Mike's jaw clenched. If there's a network behind this, Johnson is just one piece of the puzzle. As the search continued, more clues began to emerge. Ledgers filled with cryptic entries, untraceable phone numbers scribbled on scraps of paper, and a series of passports bearing different names but the same photograph, Johnson's. It was a carefully constructed operation, one that had likely gone undetected for years. Mike stared at the evidence spread out on the table in the living room. "This isn't just about one man. This is organized trafficking." Sarah nodded, her expression grim. "And Johnson's house was a hub. We've got enough to tie him to Ethan's captivity, but we need to uncover the rest of his connections." Later that night, Mike and Sarah returned to the station, where Ethan was being cared for by CPS. Janice met them in the hallway, her face a mix of relief and sorrow. "Ethan's in rough shape," Janice said. "He's malnourished and scared, but he's talking a little. He mentioned other kids who were here before him." Mike's chest tightened. "Do we know where they are now?" Janice shook her head. "Not yet, but if what he says is true, there are more children out there who need our help." Sarah's voice was firm. "We're not stopping until we find them. Johnson may have been the face of this, but there's a network behind him, and we're going to take it down." As they prepared for the long fight ahead, both officers knew this case was far from over. But with every piece of evidence, every rescued child, they were one step closer to justice. The station was abuzz with activity as the evidence collected from the Johnson mansion began to unravel a chilling operation. The ledger found in the basement, coupled with Ethan's account and Lily's descriptions, painted a horrifying picture of a child trafficking network that had been operating under the radar for years. Every new lead seemed to reveal another layer of the crime, and the weight of the case pressed heavily on Mike and Sarah. Mike sat in the interrogation room, facing Philip Johnson, who had been silent since his arrest. Johnson's previously calm demeanor had crumbled. His shirt was wrinkled, and his once perfectly combed hair was disheveled. But his eyes still held defiance, a glint of arrogance that suggested he believed he could beat the charges. Sarah stood behind Mike, her arms crossed, her expression icy. She leaned in slightly, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "We've got enough evidence to bury you, Johnson. The hidden rooms, the ledgers, the passports. You're not walking away from this." Johnson smirked, but his voice wavered. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? You're just scratching the surface. You don't know who you're dealing with." Mike's jaw tightened. "Then why don't you enlighten us? Because right now, you're the one facing life behind bars. Help us, and maybe the DA will show some leniency." Johnson leaned back, his smirk fading. "If I talk, I'm as good as dead. And so are you." Back in the observation room, Sarah paced, her frustration palpable. "He's stonewalling. He knows we're close, but he's not going to give up the network without a fight." Mike rubbed his temples. "He's scared, and that's good. It means he knows we're a threat to whoever he's working for. but we need more leverage. Just then, one of the tech officers burst into the room, holding a tablet. You need to see this. The officer placed the tablet on the table, showing surveillance footage pulled from a nearby storage facility. The grainy video showed Johnson meeting with two other men in a darkened lot. Large crates were loaded into a van, and though the footage didn't show the contents, the timestamp matched the late-night deliveries Mrs. Jenkins had mentioned. Who are the others? Sarah asked, her eyes narrowing. We're running facial recognition now, the tech officer replied. But based on the intel from the ledgers, one of them could be a known trafficker operating out of New Jersey. Mike nodded. If we can identify and link them to Johnson, we'll have enough to bring down more than just this operation. Later that evening, Mike and Sarah reviewed Ethan's statements again, searching for any details they might have missed. The boy, now in protective custody, had described being moved between locations, always in unmarked vehicles, always at night. He mentioned hearing other children's voices during the transfers, though he never saw them. There's a pattern here, Sarah said, highlighting the locations Ethan had described. If we cross-reference these spots with the ledgers, we might find where the other kids were taken. Mike pointed to a specific entry in the ledger. Look at this. Shipments marked with initials instead of descriptions. It's the same pattern repeated over and over. If these initials correspond to locations or contacts, we might have our next lead. Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her expression hardened. Facial recognition hit. One of the men in the footage is a known associate of Johnson, a guy named Victor Salinas. He's been flagged by multiple agencies for suspected trafficking, but has always slipped through the cracks. Mike stood, grabbing his jacket. Then it's time to pay Salinas a visit. The team moved quickly, coordinating with federal agents to track Salinas. They found him at a high-end restaurant in Manhattan, dining as if he didn't have a care in the world. When the officers moved in, his arrogance melted into panic. As Salinas was cuffed and let out, Sarah leaned close and whispered, Johnson rolled the dice with you. He lost. Now it's your turn to talk. Back at the precinct, Salinas proved more cooperative than Johnson. Faced with mounting evidence, he spilled details about the operation. How children were smuggled in from various states, how the network communicated through encrypted messages, and how Johnson's mansion served as a temporary holding facility. Mike and Sarah worked through the night, piecing together Salinas's testimony with the evidence they already had. By dawn, they had mapped out a sprawling network spanning multiple states, with Johnson as one of its key players. We're not just stopping a trafficker, Mike said, his voice filled with determination. We're dismantling an entire operation. Sarah nodded, her exhaustion evident, but her resolve unwavering. And we're going to make sure they never rebuild. The morning after Johnson's arrest and Salinas's confession, the precinct was buzzing with activity. The media had caught wind of the operation, and the story was already making headlines. Reporters gathered outside, eager for updates on what was quickly becoming one of the most significant trafficking busts in the city's history. Mike sat at his desk, reviewing the finalized report. The arrest had led to the rescue of 4 more children that night, all of whom were being cared for by CPS and medical professionals. Each child's story added another layer of horror, but also strengthened the case against the network. Sarah walked into the bullpen, her face drawn but triumphant. The DA's office is filing charges against Johnson, Salinas, and 2 more suspects we picked up this morning. This is going to be a landmark case. Mike leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. Good. But we're not done yet. We've got leads on other locations tied to this network. We need to keep the pressure on. Sarah nodded. We will. But first, there's someone here you should see. Mike followed Sarah to the waiting area, where a group of neighbors from the Johnson Mansion's neighborhood stood. At the front was Mrs. Jenkins, clutching a cane and flanked by 2 younger residents. When she saw Mike, her face lit up with relief. Officer Thompson, she said, her voice shaking slightly. We just wanted to thank you and your team. For Lily, for Ethan, for all of them. You did what so many of us were too afraid to do. Mike smiled warmly. Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. But you're the one who had the courage to come forward. Without your help, we wouldn't have gotten this far. Another neighbor stepped forward, a middle-aged man with a somber expression. We're organizing a community meeting. We want to make sure something like this never happens again. It's time we take a closer look at what's happening around us. Sarah, standing beside Mike, added, "That's a good start." Awareness and vigilance are the best tools against predators like Johnson and his associates. The more people are paying attention, the harder it is for these operations to thrive. Later that evening, a candlelight vigil was held in a nearby park. Families, community leaders, and law enforcement officers gathered to honor the children who had been rescued and to remember those still unaccounted for. Lily and Ethan, though not present for safety reasons, were at the forefront of everyone's minds. A local pastor addressed the crowd, his voice filled with emotion. "Tonight, we stand together as a community. We mourn the innocents lost, but we also celebrate the bravery of those who stepped forward to bring this darkness into the light. Let this be a reminder that we all have a role to play in protecting our children." Mike and Sarah stood at the back of the crowd, the glow of candles reflecting in their eyes. For a moment, the weight of the case seemed to lift as they saw the impact their work had made. "We did good, Mike," Sarah said quietly. "We made a difference." Mike nodded, his gaze fixed on the flickering lights. "Yeah, but it doesn't end here. There are more kids out there who need us, and we're going to find them." Over the next few weeks, the arrests snowballed into a larger crackdown. Tips flooded in from across the city, leading to more rescues and arrests. The case became a rallying cry for stricter laws and more robust protections for vulnerable children. Lily and Ethan were placed with loving foster families, and though their journeys to healing were just beginning, they were no longer alone. Sarah visited Lily one afternoon, bringing her a set of new crayons and coloring books. Lily hugged her tightly, her once fearful eyes now filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. Sarah knelt down, smiling. "You're brave, Lily. You helped us stop them. Don't ever forget that." As the case moved toward trial, Mike and Sarah knew their work was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, they felt hope, a belief that, together, they could make the world a little safer for children like Lily and Ethan. And in the quiet moments, when the chaos of their work subsided, they remembered the words of Mrs. Jenkins. "You did what so many of us were too afraid to do." It was a reminder that courage didn't always roar. It often spoke softly through actions that made all the difference. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and check out this next story. It's incredibly moving.